Hello and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and this is Political Exchange. My guest tonight is South African Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan. Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you for joining us. We hear constantly that South Africa is in danger of losing its economic prominence on the African continent to competitor economies such as Nigeria, Egypt and even Ethiopia. Just how healthy are South Africa's economic and developmental prospects going forward?
Well, as the economists will say, I think our fundamentals are excellent at the moment. We have the lowest interest rates we've had for over 30 years. Our fiscal situation is extremely sound. Our debt levels will be around 41% of GDP even in a year or two. Our deficit is 4.6%. We've managed to recover from the impact of the global financial crisis. Fiscally, up to a point. We haven't recovered all of the revenue, but we've managed the fiscus in a way in which the deficit is under control. I think we made the right decision not to do what some of the European countries have done, which is to cut expenditure radically. We've said that we will undertake a fiscal consolidation exercise over a period of time in order to not endanger the prospects of growth and job creation. And now the world agrees that that's precisely the way the world, not let alone South Africa, should actually do it. Where our challenges lie are in the area of clearly job creation, and you require a combination of higher growth levels, a different form of labor absorption, greater industrialization, as some of my colleagues have been talking about, and a different trade dynamic, which doesn't rely upon old trade partners, sustains those old relationships, but builds new ones. And we're beginning to move in that area as well. And in that sense, we might be at the beginnings of an interesting period where we can increase growth, increase job creation, make our society less unequal than it is at the present moment, which is a challenge that many around the world have as well. And in the African context, it's actually healthy to have competition. What we've got to learn to do, though, is have what I would call cooperative competition, because there are many areas in which we have to cooperate. For example, infrastructure. The greatest need on the African continent is to get regional integration through regional infrastructure. And those projects, by their very nature, require cooperation between two or more countries. And the leaders of the African Union, of all 54 countries, have now committed to various infrastructure projects, all of them linked to increasing connectivity within the African continent and ensuring that we improve trade logistics, particularly. As you know, Africa is way behind in terms of intracontinental trade, just 10 or 11%. Yes. Compared to the 60% of Europe and a similar number in Asia as well.
Minister, if I can just come in there, the SADC recently approved an ambitious infrastructure, build plan. But given Africa's poor access to financial markets, where is the money to match the ambition actually going to come from?
Well, there's various initiatives. Firstly, we do have the African Development Bank. Secondly, we have institutions like the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And there are similar nascent structures elsewhere on the continent. Thirdly, there have been efforts, and they're beginning to gain more momentum, to mobilize the pension and savings resources within the African continent in a way in which we could collectively have access to them. Fourth, there's a great interest in investment in African infrastructure from what are clearly cash surpluses around the world. And those surpluses need to find places where they can invest themselves and get the right kind of returns. And by all accounts, Africa offers amongst the best returns that any investor could hope to have. What we've got to balance that off with is perceptions of risk. And I think that's why it's excellent that CNBC is launching this program, so that we could get a more balanced perspective, a better and more profound understanding, of both the challenges of this continent, but the exciting possibilities it has to offer as well.
Let's park Africa and return to South Africa. You've recently had to adjust growth forecast to below 3% as the effect of the European crisis obviously begins to bite countries that export to the EU, such as South Africa. That's one of the major extraneous factors that's affecting South Africa. But what, in your view, are the domestic inhibitors of accelerated growth?
Those are today fortunately well known as well, and it's good that we have a public conversation about them, and are very similar to other African countries. Firstly, we have energy shortages, and in the next, say, 2 or 3 years, we'll overcome much of that. But in the African continent, there are similar challenges but opportunities to create an Africa-wide grid, to use the INGA project in a lot more productive way, for example. So in South Africa, we do have a plan. We've got to get further down the line in terms of the power stations coming live, and that will relieve some of the pressure we have. Secondly, South Africa is a water-scarce country. So you've got to use water in a wise way and in a rational way, and ensure that, for example, if there's a mining or manufacturing project being implemented, that the adequate water supplies, licenses issued the right way, and so on. Thirdly, we could do better at some of the red tape issues, and I think that's an area government is working at, but needs to do a lot more to make it easier, particularly for small businesses, to get off the ground. The larger businesses are fine, and they know the ropes, and they have enough advisors.
But Minister, there are those who argue that the structural rigidities in the economy is still preventing accelerated growth. And the kind of growth that we need to dent unemployment and poverty is in the region of 7%. We are far below that.
We are.
What are we doing to address those structural rigidities?
These are amongst the structural rigidities. Amongst the most prominent of those is the next one I was going to mention, which is skills. And given our history, we are particularly short on skills. And there are efforts now to get trade unions, business, and government to work together, but we certainly need to apply ourselves with a greater sense of urgency and either in the short term import some of those skills, and we are getting in migration from the continent itself, which is extremely helpful, but our own learning institutions, universities, what we call further education and training colleges, need to upgrade their output. For example, my colleague, the Minister of Health, is trying to almost double the number of medical students that would be taken on board. If we can achieve that in the next year or two, that would begin a process which in about 5 or 6 years would give us a larger number of doctors and medical personnel that would be available. So there is an acute awareness that there are these structural constraints, there are things that are very peculiar to our own country, given our own peculiar history, and that we need to do better at converting policy into action.
Let's talk about youth unemployment. Everyone is agreed that it's politically unsustainable. Youth unemployment is twice that of general unemployment. Now, you've been set to champion the idea of a youth wage subsidy to encourage enterprises to hire more young people. Some argue that you've even sponsored pilot projects, of the project. What has the study found, and are you likely to make these findings public anytime soon?
The study is still to be completed, once it is available, which should be later in the year, we'll certainly make it public, because we can all, as government and as the private sector and as civil society, learn about the feedback that we are obtaining through this particular study, which is done in collaboration with the University of Witwatersrand. And youth unemployment, both in South Africa, on the continent, and elsewhere in the world, is no doubt a phenomenal challenge. And you can see, for example, the recent protests in Spain, where a government which has just had a clear majority is now being challenged, largely because they have to implement austerity measures, which we haven't done, and that's very important, and find, in their case, 65 billion euros in just a period of 2 years. And those cuts have a massive impact on the economy more generally, but also on the welfare of people. Now, we haven't walked that road, But we certainly do need to do imaginative, innovative, and flexible things in order to tackle both the further education and training of youth on the one hand, and their absorption into either public finance sponsored projects or within our industry as well. I think the private sector can do a lot more. There's still a gap between our understanding of the challenge and their understanding of the challenge. And that's, again, part of our history. And that divide hasn't been closed adequately. While some business leaders are beginning to go beyond the norm and say, I'll take on 100 youngsters and give them their first opportunity to get work experience. If we multiply those efforts, we could actually have a phenomenal result in a year. Subsidy or no subsidy.
But there has been criticism that business is sitting on cash, that they're not wanting to invest. What are you doing to encourage them? And is the wage youth subsidy not just another incentive to business instead of to young people who actually need the assistance and the training?
We need both. Business sits on cash here and elsewhere in the world because they see the environment as a risky environment. They see developments in Europe as providing an element of, and perhaps more than just an element of uncertainty. Because remember, some are saying that that situation could last anything between 3 and 10 years. And if you are a European-orientated business, then you begin to wonder, well, who am I going to trade with, and what am I going to manufacture my goods for, and would I be able to sell my products elsewhere in the world, which is what my colleague in Trade and Industry is beginning to encourage people to do. So, but secondly, business also needs to develop a far-sighted and visionary component, which is we are on a very different continent. Growth rates here amongst the higher ones around the world, the second highest compared to Asia. And there are exciting opportunities of a very low base to capitalize where in various areas, whether it's telecommunications, retail, finance, and many businesses are actually doing so already. And what we require is a investment model which ensures that the South African-based business benefits, but we also create business enterprises in other parts of Africa which provide benefits to those countries in which we are investing as well. As far as where do you give incentives, remember that one of the biggest incentive programs we run is for the motor industry. Over the last couple of years, some 40 or 50 billion rands have been spent in this industry in order to keep the industry here, in order to get them to invest more here and create more jobs here. Remember also that through our tax system, for the last 10 or 12 years, we've had various regimes called accelerated depreciation and all sorts of allowances for capital goods and so on, all of them designed to encourage business to invest and to develop their businesses. And a unique one that we've had probably for the last 4 years or so, or 5, is the Urban Development Grant. And that's made a phenomenal difference to the city centers of Durban, Johannesburg, and others. And there's a request for much of that to be extended for another few years. So incentives do play an important part in encouraging businesses to do the thing that we would think is in the national interest. Who should the money go to? Young people themselves or to businesses? Depends what you want to achieve. One of the things that doesn't work in South Africa is what we might call information symmetry. Does everybody who needs to have information about employment opportunities have the information? Do our labor institutions work correctly? Are young people in a township able to connect with these institutions, and are the institutions able to connect a work seeker with a person offering employment? Now, parts of it work. I think they could work a lot better. And we need to focus our minds on those institutional links, get better information symmetry, get training institutions to become better aligned with businesses and their needs. But the key critique of South Africa, which you will see in newspapers even today, is the small business element is missing.
Let's talk about the small business element. We've heard for a long time that Nsika and Kula are going to merge, but a lot of small businesses complain of excessive red tape, bureaucracy, and we've seen recently even bigger businesses going under because of cash flow problems and so on. What is government doing to accelerate, the consolidation of support for small to medium term enterprises?
Well, I believe the project is more or less complete, but I think we would as government admit that there's a gap that we need to fill more adequately, not only as government but also as the financial institutions in South Africa, and get a more flexible approach to supporting small business, but also get people to work for those institutions that understand small business, that have been in business themselves. So apart from giving cash, we also require the ability to mentor small businesses. Now, the DTI, for example, Trade and Industry, has any number of incubation projects. We need to multiply that so that you come in as a young person who wants to start a business, you have this incubation opportunity, you get backup in terms of financial literacy, you get backup in terms of business advice, you get the right kind of mentoring for X number of years, and then you branch off and run your business on an independent basis. So there's some exciting, if you like, experiments that are being conducted at the moment. For example, Richard Branson has an entrepreneurship NGO that operates in Johannesburg, which is also creating fairly exciting entrepreneurs and backup for them. What we require is for these experiments now, firstly, to teach us some lessons about what's right and wrong in the way we work, but secondly, to scale up. My colleague in Science and Technology, for example, Minister Pando, has some interesting thoughts on incubation in that area, so that we begin to support investment in research, investment in innovation. Another area is the connectivity between our research institutions and our businesses. Now, in the old days, 30, 40 years ago, that connectivity was there. There was a symbiotic relationship between business and higher institutions of learning. Today, that seems very tenuous. We've got to rebuild that, because the competitive advantage that we are going to have over time is our ability to innovate, our ability to meet the requirements of new generations of people in very different geopolitical circumstances. And we have very good research institutions like the CSIR, and we have fairly substantial businesses. Now, can we get the connection going, both to support the bigger businesses, but also to have spillover effects of a beneficial sort into the smaller businesses as well?
Let's talk about the role of business. You've recently been very critical of the banks and their role in the current global crisis. Now, banks and businesses generally are, of course, even more important in the development story of South Africa. What is your assessment of the role of South African business as a social partner driving change and development?
Well, let's cover the banking area. My comments were directed at the global banks, who, as you know, in 2007, as a result of the way they have managed mortgages to the so-called subprime sector and development of derivatives based on those mortgages, have created a disaster. Millions of jobs have been lost. We ourselves lost 60 billion rands in revenue, which we haven't recovered. And it has set into motion huge cracks in the global economy and regional economies around the world, to the extent where you have slowdowns taking place in China, India, Brazil, which are going to be counterproductive, because those have been the locomotives of global growth for the last 3 or 4 years. And the more recent developments amongst any number of banks, I'm not going to mention anyone in particular, have demonstrated to commentators throughout the world that the financial sector is moving along the lines of an incorrect business culture, that the short-termism in that sector is causing to bring to bear the wrong kinds of incentives, which is then bringing about the wrong kinds of behaviors, which then leads to the kind of LIBOR and other phenomena that we're seeing, and that's not the only one. So if you look at the last 6 weeks alone, any number of financial institutions have had to pay one or other kind of fine, have one or other kind of leader resign, and make admissions of malfeasance of one kind or another as well. And we are merely joining those who are saying financial institutions are a very important part of any economy. You require a different culture and a higher level of responsibility amongst leaders in that sector to make sure that in the pursuit of profit and bonuses, they don't create the kind of damage that they're creating and have created around the world. And ensure also that the kind of regulatory momentum that the G20 was developing through the Financial Stability Board is not diluted in any way. Because there's a huge pushback to say, you're over-regulating us. You might actually have unintended consequences either on sovereigns or on banks themselves. Mm-hmm. And banks, as you point out, are the lifeblood of business.
What about South African banks? Are South African banks...
By contrast, South African banks are well regulated. Their leadership has been extremely well directed, and that's why the focus has been on the global banks. But the global banks are powerful. If the European...
Is there knock-on effect in the domestic market?
Not that we can see at this point in time. But on the African continent, for example...
LIBOR is not an issue for Africa?
No. It's amongst the bigger banks that these transactions actually take place. What is an issue is that, for example, trade finance can dry up because it's largely European banks that offer trade finance. So you had a dip and now you have a partial recovery, and various institutions had to come out in support to bolster trade. So South African banks are in a different class, both in terms of regulation and in terms of management. But we have our own domestic issues. Are they lending enough to small business? Are they supporting micro business adequately? The numbers seem to indicate that we could have improvements in that area. There have been complaints about the kind of services they offer, the charges and the lack of transparency in the charges, all of which are subjects of conversation with them. And we hope that through that and other forms of persuasion, we'll begin to see a change in conduct.
Mm-hmm. Quickly, just the general optimism about Africa as an investment destination and the center of growth is well acknowledged. But of course, there are challenges, and there remain challenges. One of the issues identified by someone like Kofi Annan recently was the question of policy inconsistency. But of course, Africa is also going through a political regeneration. So there is regular elections, which does result in changes of government. How do you balance the need for policy consistency and, of course, also the changeover that must happen as a consequence of people exercising their democratic rights?
It's an issue that recently in Addis was subject of discussion amongst finance ministers from the continent. And one of the things we acknowledged is that we must stop being clean brooms each time there's a change of government as a result of an election. In other words, Africa needs, like ourselves, two things. One is reasonably medium-term continuity in policy and consistency, and changes on the margin which will enable us to respond to new developments in the continent or in the global situation. And getting that balance right, which reinforces continuity on the one hand and leaves sufficient room for flexibility and agility, is what I think in vision terms we want to get to. Politicians, of course, will always have the need to say, I'm different and I want to do something different. We need to temper that with the need for allowing policies to actually begin to embed themselves so that we can learn lessons from those policy implementation, not from the policy itself, and then begin to undertake the adaptations that are necessary. And hopefully we are going to begin to move in that direction. But clearly on the continent, we also have the opportunity to remodel the way some of the economic institutions and political institutions and how they work. So there's some interesting studies more recently which show the connectivity between inclusive political institutions and inclusive economic institutions, and a population that's better benefiting from the results of growth. Now, Africa has the opportunity not just to talk about how good an investment location we are, but also we could provide leadership to the globe by saying there are different ways in which you can still have responsible market behavior, but a different kind of institutional arrangement which would ensure that you don't have this 1% and 99% divide being perpetuated on the African continent. And that's a challenge that African leaders, whether they're in business or in civil society or in politics, need to pick up.
President Jacob Zuma recently characterized Africa's trade relationship with China as skewed. How can Africa recalibrate its relationship with this emerging superpower so that it's more responsive to the continent's own developmental needs?
Well, clearly the conversations that seem to have happened in China in the last week are very useful as a pointer to perhaps a new phase in the relationship between China and Africa. A phase which says, don't just use our raw materials, help us to add value to them here. A phase which says, take some of your factories and base them here. Thirdly, increase your demand for goods that are made in Africa, so that we could create jobs and enterprises within the African continent, and direct your future investments both in terms of improving our infrastructure, but increasingly help us to industrialize, to innovate, to create research and development capability within the continent itself. And I think it's very useful that you could have such a frank and open conversation, if you like, between leaders of Africa and leaders of China. And there seems to be a commitment to begin this new phase, and hopefully we'll begin to see a change.